The Interstellar Military Academy floated in the darkness of space like a giant metal flower with petals made of steel and glass. And inside its massive halls walked the future officers of 17 different alien species who had come from every corner of the known galaxy to learn how to work together and maybe, one day, lead fleets of their own station. Prometheus 7 was the official name, but everyone just called it the Academy because that was easier to say, and everyone knew what you meant when you said it. And for 300 years, this place had taken young cadets from planets that used to be enemies and turned them into something like a family. Cadet Urith walked through the crowded corridors with his scales shifting colors as they always did when he was thinking about something important. And right now, he was thinking about lunch because morning combat training had left him exhausted, and his stomach was making sounds that he hoped no one else could hear. He was a Valaran, which meant he had smooth iridescent scales that covered his entire body and changed color based on his emotions, whether he wanted them to or not. And this was very annoying when you were trying to hide how you felt about something, but also useful when you needed to communicate without words. His best friend Crix walked beside him on 4 legs while her other 4 arms carried data pads and training equipment. And she clicked her mandibles in what Urith had learned was the manted way of laughing at something funny. "Your scales are turning orange again," Crix said with amusement in her voice, "which means you are either very hungry or very embarrassed. And I am guessing hungry based on the sounds coming from your midsection." "I did not eat breakfast," Urith admitted as they turned toward the mess hall, "because someone kept me up all night with questions about human history for the cultural studies exam." "That someone helped you pass that exam," Crix reminded him, "so that someone deserves gratitude, not complaints." They entered the mess hall together, and the noise hit them like a wave crashing on a beach, with dozens of different languages mixing together into a sound that was somehow both chaotic and comforting at the same time. Urith spotted their usual table in the corner near the usual table in the corner near windows that looked out at the stars. And he could see that Dorvash was already there, taking up most of one side of the table, because Borvians were very large creatures with 6 eyes and thick gray skin that looked like rock. And next to Dorvash sat Elena Vasquez, who was the only human in their training squad. And she was reading something on her datapad while eating her lunch with the kind of calm focus that Urith had come to expect from her. Elena was strange in a way that Urith could not quite explain. And it was not because humans looked strange, though they did look strange with their soft skin and their hair and their flat faces with forward-facing eyes like predators, even though they insisted they were not predators. Know the strange thing about Elena was how ordinary she seemed, and how that ordinariness somehow made her more interesting rather than less interesting. Urith and Crix got their food from the dispensers that created species-appropriate meals and made their way to the table. And Dorvash greeted them with a rumbling sound that meant hello in his language. "Training was difficult today," Dorvash said in his deep voice that sounded like rocks grinding together. "And I am tired, and my muscles hurt, and I want to sleep for many hours." "You say that every day," Crix pointed out as she arranged her meal in the precise pattern that mantids require before they could eat. "And yet every day you wake up early to train some more." "That is because I am dedicated," Dorvash replied with something like pride in his voice. "And also because my mother would be disappointed if I gave up, and I am more afraid of her disappointment than I am of tired muscles." Elena looked up from her datapad and smiled at this, which made her face look softer and more approachable. And Urith noticed that she had the same meal she always had, which was some kind of protein that humans called steak, even though it was made by machines and not from actual animals. "Your mother sounds like a wise person," Elena said to Dorvash. I think fear of disappointing our parents is universal across all species. This was the thing about Elena that Yurith appreciated most. The way she could take something that seemed like a small comment and find the connection that linked all of them together, despite their very different bodies and cultures and histories. The mess hall was crowded today, because all the training squads had the same lunch period, and Yurith could see Vorns and Mantids and Borvians and at least 10 other species all eating together in a scene that would have been impossible just a few centuries ago when everyone was fighting everyone else. Peace was still new enough that the older generations did not quite trust it. But Yurith and his friends had grown up in a galaxy where cooperation was normal and war was just something you read about in history lessons. He had just started eating when he noticed that the noise level in the mess hall had changed. And it took him a moment to realize that people were getting quieter instead of louder, which was strange, because usually meals got noisier as more cadets arrived. Crix had stopped eating, and her compound eyes were fixed on something near the maintenance hatches on the far side of the room. And Yurith followed her gaze and felt his scales turn pale gray before he even understood what he was seeing. 3 figures had emerged from a hatch that should have been locked and secured, and they were moving with the fluid grace of creatures who had never in their entire evolutionary history needed to fear anything else. Krethvari. His mind supplied the name with a cold feeling spreading through his chest. They were juveniles, which he could tell from their size, because adults would have been even larger. But even as juveniles, they stood nearly 2 meters tall with muscles that rippled under skin the color of midnight and claws that gleamed like polished obsidian in the artificial light. The Krethvari were apex predators from the Outer Rim territories, and their species had been denied membership in the Galactic Concord because they refused to give up what they called traditional hunting, which everyone else called murder. And now 3 of their young were standing in the mess hall of the academy with grins on their faces that showed rows and rows of teeth designed for tearing flesh. And the alarms that should have warned everyone were completely silent. How did they get in? Dorvash whispered, with all 6 of his eyes wide with fear. No one had an answer. And no one had time to find one because the Krethvari had started to move through the crowd with the lazy confidence of predators who knew that nothing here could stop them. The Krethvari were not attacking anyone, and somehow that made everything worse because Yurith could have understood an attack, but what they were doing instead was something his brain struggled to process. They were playing. The largest of the 3 was a female, with a scar across her snout that looked like it came from a fight with something that had actually managed to hurt her. And she bounded from table to table with movements that were almost beautiful in their deadly efficiency. She landed on a table full of Valoran cadets, and they scattered like leaves in a strong wind, their scales flashing through every shade of gray and white that meant terror in their color language. And she laughed at them with a clicking sound that made Yurith want to curl into a ball and disappear. One of her brothers chased a group of mantids across the room just for the joy of watching them run, and he would catch up to them and snap his jaws just behind their heads before letting them go and starting the chase again. The 3rd sibling had found a Borvian who was frozen in place with fear, and he circled the massive creature like a predator examining prey, poking at the thick gray skin with one claw just to watch the Borvian flinch. Look at how they shake. The female called out to her siblings with glee in her voice. Look at how they tremble and cower and beg without even speaking words. She snatched a meal tray from a cadet who had been too scared to run, and she ate his food, while he watched with tears running down his face. And she made sounds of pleasure as she chewed just to let him know how much she was enjoying his helplessness. This is better than hunting real prey, one of her brothers agreed as he knocked over a table just to hear the crash and the screams that followed. Because real prey just runs and dies, but these ones run and live and keep being afraid. Urith could not move, and he hated himself for it, but his body had stopped listening to his brain a long time ago, and all he could do was sit there with his scales the color of death, while every muscle locked in place. This was what his species did when faced with predators, because millions of years of evolution had taught the Valorans that fighting was useless and running was pointless, and the only chance of survival was to freeze and hope the predator looked somewhere else. But the predator was not looking somewhere else, and in fact the female HFY had noticed their table and was making her way toward them with that horrible clicking laugh. Crix had wrapped all four of her arms around herself in a defensive posture that mantids used when they had accepted death, and her compound eyes tracked the approaching predator with the helpless focus of someone who could not look away no matter how much they wanted to. Dorvash had curled into a ball despite his massive size, because Borvians were herd animals, and their defense was to group together and protect each other. But there was no herd here and no protection, and so all he could do was make himself as small as possible and hope. The female landed on their table with a crash that shook Urith down to his bones, and she crouched there like a nightmare made of muscle and claws and teeth. And she looked down at them with eyes that held no mercy, because mercy was a concept her species had never needed to learn. "This one has pretty scales," she said, while reaching down to grab Urith's meal tray. "And they change colors, which is amusing, because right now they are the color of fear. And I like that color very much." She ate his food slowly and deliberately, while making sure he watched every bite. And her brothers had joined her now, so all three predators were focused on their little group. "The bug one smells like chemicals," one brother observed while leaning close to Crix, who made a small sound of terror. "Probably poison, but we are immune to most poisons, so that is not very useful, is it? The big gray one is pretending to be a rock." The other brother laughed while poking at Dorvash's curled form. "But rocks do not shake like that, so I do not think the disguise is working." The female had finished Urith's meal and was looking around the table for more food to steal when she noticed Elena, and something in her expression shifted from amusement to curiosity. Elena had not moved from her seat, and she had not stopped eating her meal, and her face showed no expression that Urith could read. "What is this one?" the female asked while tilting her head in the way that predators do when they see something they do not understand. "Human," one of her brothers answered. "From the inner worlds where everything is soft and weak and boring. It does not run," the female observed with interest. "And it does not freeze like the scale one, or curl up like the rock one, or shake like the bug one." She leaned closer to Elena with her teeth just a few centimeters from the human's face, and Urith wanted to scream a warning, but his voice was frozen along with everything else. "Maybe it is broken," the female suggested. "Or maybe it is too stupid to understand what is happening." Elena continued eating as if three apex predators were not surrounding her table, and as if her friends were not paralyzed with terror beside her, and as if this was just another normal lunch period at the academy. The female's eyes narrowed, and for the first time since entering the mess hall, she looked uncertain about something. And that uncertainty made her angry, because HFY did not like feeling uncertain about anything. "I'm going to eat your food now," she announced to Elena with challenge in her voice. "And you are going to watch and be afraid like all the others." Her brother reached down and grabbed Elena's tray and pulled it away from her with a motion that was meant to be intimidating and aggressive. Elena let him take it without resistance, and then she set down her fork with a small click against the table surface. She placed her knife beside the fork and aligned them so they were perfectly parallel, and she looked up at the HFY female with eyes that held something Urith had never seen before, something that made His scales shift to a color. He did not have a name for something that made the clicking. Laughter of the predators falls silent for the first time since they had entered the room. The mess hall had gone quiet in a way that felt wrong, because a room full of terrified people should have been loud with screaming and crying, but instead there was only silence as everyone watched what was happening. At the corner table, the Krethvari female was staring at Elena with an expression that kept shifting between confusion and anger. And her brothers had stopped their games to join her because something interesting was finally happening. "You are looking at me," the female said with a tone that suggested this was some kind of offense. "And you are not afraid." Elena did not respond with words, but she also did not look away, and her gaze was steady and calm in a way that seemed to bother the predator more than any amount of screaming or begging would have. "I asked you a question, pray," the female growled while leaning closer until her breath was hot against Alana's face. "And when I ask questions, you answer them." "You did not ask a question," Elena replied in a voice that was perfectly level and perfectly calm. "You made a statement, and statements do not require answers." Yurith felt his scales flash through several colors at once because he could not believe what he was hearing. And beside him, Crix made a small clicking sound that might have been shock or might have been the beginning of a heart attack. The Krethvari female pulled back slightly, and her eyes narrowed as she processed what had just happened because no prey had ever spoken to her like that, and she was not entirely sure how to respond. "You think you are clever," she finally said with danger in her voice. "But clever prey is still just prey, and clever words do not stop teeth and claws." "I do not think I am clever," Elena said while reaching up to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear in a gesture that was so casual it seemed almost insulting. "I am simply answering your not question with a clarification." The brother who had stolen Elena's tray was still holding it awkwardly because he had expected fear and submission, and instead he was getting a grammar lesson. And he looked to his sister for guidance on what to do next. "Maybe this one is broken in the head," he suggested while tapping his own skull with one claw. "Because only something broken would act like this when death is standing right in front of it." "I am not broken," Elena said with that same calm voice. "And you are not death, because death does not play with food and make jokes and laugh at frightened children." The female's expression shifted again, and this time there was something new in her eyes that looked almost like the beginning of uncertainty. And Yurith realized that Elena had just called the apex predators children and somehow made it sound like an insult. "We are Krethvari," the female said with pride that sounded slightly defensive now. "And we are the greatest hunters in the galaxy, and every species in the known worlds fears our name." "Yes," Elena agreed with a small nod. "Every species fears your name, and that must be very satisfying for you." There was something in the way she said it that made the words feel like they contained a hidden meaning. And the female's claws scraped against the table surface as her hands tightened into fists. "You do not fear us," the female said, and this time it was definitely a question, even if it was phrased like a statement. "No," Elena answered simply, "I do not." The mess hall seemed to hold its breath as these words hung in the air. And Yurith could see other cadets watching from behind overturned tables and from corners where they had tried to hide. And all of them were staring at the human with expressions of disbelief. The female leaned in again, and this time she opened her mouth to show all of her teeth in a display that had made entire species surrendered to the Krethvari over thousands of years of conquest and terror. "I could kill you before you could blink," she hissed with absolute confidence. "I could tear you apart before anyone could stop me, and there is nothing you could do about it." Elena met her gaze without flinching, and without looking away, and without showing any reaction at all to the rows of razor-sharp teeth that were centimeters from her face. "Yes," Elena said. "You probably could." And then she smiled. It was not a big smile, and it did not show any teeth, and it barely even changed the shape of her mouth. But somehow it was the most unsettling thing Urith had ever seen in his entire life. The female pulled back from that smile like she had been burned. And her brothers shifted their weight in a way that looked almost nervous. And for the first time since entering the room, the Krethvari did not look like predators enjoying a game. They looked like creatures who had just noticed something wrong but could not figure out what it was. "Why are you smiling?" The female demanded with anger that sounded like it was covering something else. "What is funny about this situation to you?" "Nothing is funny," Elena said, while that small smile stayed on her face. "I am simply comfortable, and when I'm comfortable, I smile. Comfortable," the female repeated with disbelief in her voice. "You are comfortable while surrounded by predators who could kill you." "Yes," Elena said. "I am very comfortable right now." And somehow those simple words spoken in that calm voice with that small smile made all three Krethvari take a step backward without realizing they were doing it. Something had shifted in the room, and everyone could feel it, even if no one could explain what it was. And the predators were no longer laughing, and the prey were no longer cowering, and everything was balanced on the edge of a moment that felt like it would change everything. Elena looked at the Krethvari female with those steady, calm eyes, and the smile faded from her face, and what replaced it was something that Urith's brain could not process because it looked like patience. Not the patience of prey waiting for danger to pass, something else entirely. Something that made his scales turn a color he had never seen before on any Valoran in his entire life. Elena Vasquez cleared her throat. It was such a small sound that Urith almost missed it. Just a tiny movement of air through vocal cords that humans made all the time when they wanted attention, or when they were about to speak, or sometimes for no reason at all. But the effect of that sound was something that Urith would remember for the rest of his life. No matter how long he lived, or how many strange things he saw in this vast and mysterious galaxy. All three Krethvari froze. Not the way prey freezes, with muscles locked and eyes wide and heart pounding so fast it might explode, but something different, and somehow worse, because these were apex predators, and apex predators were not supposed to freeze for any reason. The female's pupils had expanded until her eyes were almost entirely black, and her breathing had changed from the slow, controlled rhythm of a hunter to something faster and more shallow that sounded almost like panic. Her brothers had pressed themselves against her sides in a formation that looked defensive, and their claws were scraping against the floor as their legs prepared for movement in a direction that was definitely not forward. "You are young," Elena said in that same calm voice she had been using the whole time. "So I am going to assume that no one ever taught you the things you need to know." She stood up from her seat slowly and deliberately. And she was not tall by human standards, which meant she was much shorter than the Kreth Vara, but somehow that did not seem to matter at all. "Humans are not prey," she said while taking one step toward the predators, and the predators took one step back. Urith watched this happen, and his brain refused to process what his eyes were showing him, because this was impossible, and it went against everything he knew about how the universe worked. Predators did not retreat from prey, and especially not from prey that was smaller and softer, and had no natural weapons to speak of. And yet here were three Krethvari backing away from a single human female who had not raised her voice or made any threatening gestures. "We are also not predators," Elena continued while taking another step. "At least not in the way that you understand predators to be." The Crethvery female tried to speak, but the only sound that came out was a clicking noise that sounded nothing like her confident laughter from before. And her brothers were practically climbing over each other in their desperation to move further away. "You come from a world where the hunt is simple," Elena said with her eyes fixed on the female, like she was the only creature in the room. "You chase and you catch and you kill, and then it is over, and you rest until you are hungry again." She took another step, and the Crethvery were pressed against the wall now with nowhere else to go. And their claws were leaving marks in the metal as they scrambled for purchase. Your prey runs until it cannot run anymore, and then it dies. And that is the end of the story every single time, without exception. Elena stopped walking and stood there with her hands at her sides, and her posture relaxed, and her expression showing nothing but calm, patient certainty. Humans do not work that way. The female finally managed to find her voice, and it came out as a whisper that was so different from her earlier confidence that Yurith almost did not recognize. "What are you?" she asked with something in her tone that sounded like genuine fear. "We are persistence hunters." Elena answered like she was explaining something to a child. "Which means we do not catch our prey by being faster or stronger or having better teeth and claws." She tilted her head slightly, and the gesture looked eerily similar to what the Crethvery had done earlier, when they were examining their victims. And seeing it reflected back at them made all three predators flinch. "We catch our prey by not stopping." The words hung in the air, and Yurith felt a chill run down his spine, even though his species was cold-blooded and should not have been able to feel chills. "Your ancestors were the fastest and the strongest," Elena continued with that patient explaining tone. "And they ruled their world because nothing could catch them, and nothing could fight them, and nothing could threaten them in any way." She smiled again, and this time the smile showed teeth. "Our ancestors were slow and weak and had no natural weapons at all. But they learned that if you chase something long enough, it will eventually stop running because everything gets tired eventually." The female made a sound that might have been a whimper, and her brothers were shaking now in a way that looked almost like vibration. Everything except humans. Elena took one final step forward, and the Crethvery tried to press themselves further into the wall like they could somehow phase through solid metal. "If they just pushed hard enough, we do not stop," Elena said with a voice that had dropped to something barely above a whisper. "We do not give up, and we do not forget, and we do not rest until we have finished what we started." She looked at each of the three predators in turn, and whatever they saw in her eyes made them look away like they could not bear to hold her gaze. "Your species learned to hunt by being the thing that everything else feared. But my species learned to hunt by being the thing that nothing could escape." The female was crying now with tears running down her dark face. And her brothers had stopped trying to retreat and were just standing there with their heads down in a posture of complete submission. "You are young," Elena repeated in a softer voice. "And you did not know these things because no one taught you. But now you know, and you will remember." She turned her back on the three apex predators, like they were not worth watching anymore. And she walked back to her seat and sat down like nothing unusual had happened. "You should probably leave now," she said, while reaching for the tray that the brother had dropped on the table. "Before security arrives and makes this more complicated than it needs to be." The Crethvery did not need to be told twice. The three Crethvery ran like their lives depended on it. And maybe in their minds, their lives really did depend on getting as far away from that human female as physically possible. They crashed through the maintenance hatch so fast that they got tangled up in each other, and the sounds of their panicked scrambling echoed through the mess hall as they disappeared into the service. Tunnels like frightened animals fleeing from a forest fire. The silence that followed was so complete that Yurith could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. And for a long moment, nobody moved or spoke or even seemed to breathe. Elena picked up her fork and cut another piece of synthesized steak and put it in her mouth and chewed with the calm satisfaction of someone enjoying a pleasant meal. "What?" Crix finally managed to say with her voice barely working. "What just happened?" Elena swallowed and looked at her friend with an expression that seemed genuinely confused, like she did not understand why everyone was staring at her. "I convinced them to leave," she said simply, which seemed like the best outcome for everyone involved. Dorvash had uncurled from his protective ball and all six of his eyes were fixed on Elena with an intensity that suggested he was trying to memorize every detail of what he had just witnessed. "You made apex predators run away," he said with awe in his deep rumbling voice. "You made Krethvari cry and submit and flee like prey animals, and you did it without touching them or threatening them or doing anything except talking. They were juveniles," Elena said like this explained everything. "And juveniles of any species are still learning about the world, and sometimes they learn things the hard way." Security teams burst into the mess hall about 30 seconds too late, and they found a room full of traumatized cadets and 3 missing predators and 1 human calmly finishing her lunch like nothing had happened. The next few hours were a blur of interviews and reports and medical checks, and Urith answered the same questions over and over until his voice was hoarse and his mind was numb. Yes, the Krethvari had entered through a maintenance hatch. Yes, they had terrorized the cadets for several minutes. Yes, they had fled suddenly and without apparent cause. No, he did not understand why they had run away. No, he could not explain what had happened at his table. The official report would later state that the juvenile Krethvari had been stowaways on a supply vessel and had entered the academy through a security flaw that was immediately corrected, and that they had fled when they realized that station security was responding to the silent alarms that they had not managed to disable. Nobody mentioned Elena or what she had done because nobody could figure out how to write it down in a way that made any sense. The Krethvari cubs were found hiding in a cargo bay 4 hours later, and they refused to come out until security could guarantee that no humans were in the area. And when they were finally captured and questioned, they would not explain what had frightened them so badly. All they would say was that they had made a mistake, and they wanted to go home, and they never wanted to see a human again for as long as they lived. Urith found Elena in the observation deck that evening, sitting alone in front of the giant windows that looked out at the stars. And he stood there for a long moment trying to find the words for the questions that were burning in his mind. "You can sit down," Elena said without turning around. "I do not bite, despite what you might be thinking right now." Urith sat down beside her, and his scales kept shifting through colors that he could not control. And they sat together in silence for a while, just watching the stars drift by. "I need to understand," Urith finally said with his voice quiet and uncertain, "because what I saw today does not fit with anything I know about the universe." Elena turned to look at him, and her eyes were soft and kind and completely different from the cold, patient gaze she had turned on the Krethvari. "What do you want to know?" she asked gently. "What are humans?" Urith said with the question that had been eating at him since the mess hall. "Because you told those predators that you are persistence hunters, but that does not explain what I saw today." Elena was quiet for a moment, like she was thinking about how to answer. And then she sighed and looked back out at the stars. "A long time ago on our homeworld," she began, "humans were not the strongest or the fastest or the deadliest creatures around. And there were many predators that could have killed us easily in a straight fight. That sounds like most prey species," Urith said with confusion in his voice. "Yes," Elena agreed. "But here is the thing that made us different from other prey species. We did not evolve to escape predators. We evolved to become predators ourselves." She held up her hand and looked at her soft fingers with their blunt nails that could not cut anything harder than fruit. We have no claws, she said, and no fangs and no venom and no armor and no natural weapons of any kind. But what we do have is endurance that no other species in the galaxy has ever matched. Endurance. Yurith repeated while trying to understand. On our homeworld, we would hunt prey by chasing it, Elena explained. Not fast chasing like a sprint, but slow chasing that could last for hours or even days. Because humans can keep moving long after other animals have collapsed from exhaustion. That sounds very inefficient, Yurith said, with his scales flickering uncertainty. It is incredibly efficient. Elena corrected with a small smile, because it means we never have to be faster or stronger than our prey. We just have to be more patient. She turned to face him fully, and her expression became more serious. But persistence hunting gave us something else besides a way to catch food, she said. It gave us a psychology that is very different from other species. Different how? Yurith asked. Most prey species evolve to fear predators and run from them and freeze when caught, Elena said. And most predator species evolve to enjoy the chase and the kill and to feel satisfied when the hunt is over. She paused, and Yurith waited for her to continue. Humans evolve to never feel satisfied, she said quietly, to never feel like the hunt is truly over. To always be ready to keep going no matter how tired or hurt or scared we are. That sounds exhausting, Yurith said with genuine sympathy. It is, Elena agreed with a laugh that sounded tired. But it also means that we do not react to threats the way other species expect us to react. She looked at him with those strange forward-facing eyes that suddenly did not seem strange anymore. When a predator threatens most species, the response is fear and submission, because that is the smart survival strategy. But when a predator threatens a human, something different happens in our brains. What happens? Yurith asked with his voice barely a whisper. We start calculating, Elena said with a smile that was not entirely friendly. Not how to escape or how to submit, but how to win. Even if winning means chasing that predator across the entire planet until one of us drops dead from exhaustion. Yurith felt his scales shift to that strange nameless color again. Those Krethvari cubs have never met anything that was not afraid of them, Elena continued. And when they looked at me and saw no fear, they did not know how to process that information. But why were they afraid of you? Yurith asked. You are smaller and weaker, and you said yourself they could have killed you. Yes, they could have, Elena agreed. But here is the thing that their instincts understood, even if their conscious minds did not. Killing me would not have ended anything. She looked back out at the stars with an expression that was ancient and patient. Humans do not forget, she said softly. And we do not forgive, and we do not give up. And when something hurts one of us, the rest of us tend to take it very personally. So if they had hurt you, Yurith said slowly as understanding began to dawn, then there would have been consequences, Elena finished. Not today, and maybe not tomorrow, but eventually, and without fail, and without mercy. She smiled, and this time it was warm and friendly, and nothing like the smile she had shown the Krethvari. Those cubs' instincts recognized something that their species has never had to deal with before, she said. They recognized that they were not looking at prey, and they were not looking at a predator either. What were they looking at? Yurith asked. Elena turned to face him one last time, and her eyes held something that was both terrifying and comforting at the same time. Something worse, she said simply. Something patient. She stood up and stretched and yawned, like she had not just explained the most frightening thing Yurith had ever heard. Anyway, I am tired, and tomorrow we have morning drills, she said with a casual wave. I will see you at breakfast. She walked away and left Yurith sitting alone, with his scales cycling through colors that his species had never needed names for, because they had never felt what he was feeling. Right now he looked out at the stars and wondered how the galaxy had ever thought that humans were the weak ones, the ordinary ones, the species that was not particularly special or dangerous, and he wondered what else the galaxy did not know about the quiet, soft-skinned creatures who smiled patiently while predators trembled before them. Far away in the cargo bay, the Krethvari cubs huddled together and whispered to each other about what they had seen, and they made promises to each other that they would tell their people what they had learned today, that there were things in the galaxy more frightening than predators.